The sun cast a golden hue over the quiet suburban neighborhood, where houses stood tall, their manicured lawns and pristine white fences exuding an air of exclusivity. It was the kind of place where neighbors greeted each other with polite nods, where everything seemed orderly, at least on the surface. But beneath this veneer of civility, prejudice still lurked in unexpected corners. Dr. Jamal Carter adjusted his tie as he pulled his sleek black sedan to a smooth stop in front of a house. A skilled and compassionate physician, he had spent years dedicating his life to saving others. But despite his accomplishments, his presence in this neighborhood would soon be met with suspicion, not recognition. Across the street, Margaret Dawson stood on her front porch, clutching a steaming cup of coffee. She was in her late 50s, with neatly curled blonde hair and an air of entitlement that followed her wherever she went. As she casually scanned the street, her eyes narrowed at the sight of the tall black man stepping out of the car. Something in her gut told her he didn't belong. Frowning, she set down her coffee and reached for her phone. Her world, and her assumptions, were about to be shaken. Dr. Jamal Carter stepped out of his car, straightening his crisp navy blue suit as he grabbed his medical bag from the passenger seat. It was a routine house call, something he had done countless times before. His patient, Mr. Henderson, was an elderly man with chronic heart issues, and Dr. Carter had promised to personally check on him after a recent episode. But as he locked his car and turned toward the house, an uneasy sensation prickled at the back of his neck. He could feel eyes on him. Margaret Dawson watched from across the street, her expression tightening with suspicion. She had lived in this neighborhood for over 20 years and prided herself on knowing every resident. She had never seen this man before. And in her mind, a black man stepping out of an expensive car in this part of town could only mean one thing: trouble. Her fingers tightened around her phone. Maybe she was overthinking it, but wasn't it better to be safe than sorry? Oblivious to Margaret's growing unease, Dr. Carter walked toward Mr. Henderson's front door, his polished shoes clicking softly against the pavement. He had no idea that, just a few feet away, a woman was already preparing to make a decision that could alter the course of his day. Margaret's paranoia grew as she saw him knock on the door. Her heart pounded. What if he was trying to break in? What if the real homeowners were in danger? The more she entertained these baseless fears, the more certain she became that she had to act. With a deep breath, she unlocked her phone and dialed 3 numbers. 911, what's your emergency? Margaret didn't hesitate. There's a suspicious man in our neighborhood, she said sharply. You need to send someone right away. Margaret's pulse quickened as she clutched her phone, her voice sharp with urgency. I don't know what he's doing, but he looks out of place, she insisted. The dispatcher on the other end remained calm, asking for details. He's a tall black man in a suit, carrying a bag. I think he's trying to break into a house. She glanced back toward Dr. Carter, who now stood patiently at the door, waiting for it to open. To her, his stillness was further proof of something sinister. Please send officers quickly, she urged, her voice laced with certainty. Inside the house, Mr. Henderson slowly made his way to the door, his frail hands gripping a wooden cane. His heart swelled with gratitude. Dr. Carter had been a lifeline during his recent health struggles. As he unlocked the door, he had no idea that outside, his doctor was already being cast in the role of a suspect. Margaret remained on her porch, watching intently. She had always considered herself a good citizen, someone who looked out for her community. Yet, she never once considered simply observing a little longer, or even walking over to ask questions. In her mind, she had done her duty. She had stopped a potential crime. Dr. Carter smiled warmly as Mr. Henderson opened the door. Good to see you, Mr. Henderson, he said, stepping inside. The old man chuckled. Come in, son. I appreciate you taking the time. Meanwhile, the 911 dispatcher relayed the call to officers in the area. Possible trespassing in progress. The voice crackled over the radio. Suspicious black male, mid-30s, wearing a suit. Caller reports he may be attempting to enter a residence unlawfully. Officer Miller, a young recruit eager to prove himself, turned to his partner, Sergeant Daniels, a veteran with years of experience. Should we treat this as a possible break-in? Miller asked, his fingers tightening on the wheel as they sped toward the location. Daniels, having seen far too many false alarms of this nature, exhaled. We proceed with caution, he said. But let's not jump to conclusions. Margaret remained by her window, eyes darting toward the house, her phone still gripped in her hands. She felt reassured knowing the police were on their way. In her mind, she had done everything right. But within minutes, her world would take an unexpected turn, one that she never saw coming. The distant wail of sirens sent a ripple of satisfaction through Margaret. She exhaled, relieved. Help was coming. She stepped off her porch, eager to see the officers handle the situation. Across the street, Dr. Carter continued his conversation with Mr. Henderson, unaware of the growing storm outside. A squad car pulled up to the curb with a sharp screech. Officer Miller and Sergeant Daniels stepped out, scanning the scene. Margaret rushed toward them, her face tight with concern. "That's him," she said, pointing at the house. "I saw him trying to get inside." Sergeant Daniels frowned, his years of experience telling him to tread carefully. "Did you see him force his way in?" he asked. Margaret hesitated. "No, but people like him." She stopped short, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Daniels exchanged a knowing glance with Miller before approaching the house. Inside, Dr. Carter was checking Mr. Henderson's pulse when the sharp knock at the door startled them both. "That's odd," Mr. Henderson muttered. "Who could that be?" Dr. Carter stood and walked to the door, only to be met by two uniformed officers and the piercing gaze of Margaret from behind them. "Sir, step outside," Officer Miller commanded, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. Dr. Carter's brow furrowed. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. "We got a report of a suspicious individual attempting to enter this residence," Miller stated, his tone firm. Mr. Henderson scoffed, his grip tightening on his cane. "What nonsense is this?" "Dr. Carter is my physician," he snapped. "I invited him here." Margaret's face drained of color. "Wait, he's a doctor?" she stammered. Dr. Carter exhaled, tired of the all-too-familiar scenario. He met Margaret's wide-eyed stare but said nothing. Before anyone could process the weight of her mistake, a sharp gasp broke the tension. Margaret clutched her chest, her breath hitching as her legs buckled beneath her. Her coffee cup slipped from her grasp, shattering against the pavement. The very man she had accused, the one she feared, was now the only one who could save her life. Margaret's breath came in short, labored gasps as she clutched her chest. A sharp, searing pain spread through her body, and her vision blurred. Panic flashed in her eyes as she stumbled, her legs giving out beneath her. The world tilted, and before she could process what was happening, she collapsed onto the pavement. "Ma'am!" Officer Miller shouted, rushing toward her. Sergeant Daniels immediately reached for his radio. "Dispatch, we have a medical emergency. Possible heart attack." Margaret writhed on the ground, her body trembling. Fear gripped her. She wasn't ready for this. Not now. Not like this. Her mind swirled with thoughts, but one truth loomed above them all. She had misjudged Dr. Carter. And now, her life rested in his hands. Without hesitation, Dr. Carter sprang into action. His years of medical training overpowered any lingering frustration he felt. Instinct took over. He knelt beside her, checking her pulse. It was weak and erratic. "She's going into cardiac distress," he said firmly. "I need space to work." Officer Miller hesitated, torn between his initial suspicion and the urgency of the situation. Sergeant Daniels, however, immediately stepped back. "You heard the man. Give him room," he ordered. Margaret's lips trembled. I'm sorry," she rasped, struggling to form words. Dr. Carter didn't waver. "Save your strength," he said, his voice calm yet authoritative. He began chest compressions, counting under his breath. Each movement was precise, controlled. Every second mattered. The woman who had accused him, who had tried to have him removed, was now gasping for air beneath his hands, reliant on his skill, his mercy. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Officer Miller's face paled as he watched the scene unfold. Margaret's breath hitched with each compression, her eyes fluttering. Paramedics were still minutes away, but time wasn't on her side. Dr. Carter worked with unwavering focus, blocking out the weight of everything that had just transpired. He wasn't thinking about injustice, about humiliation, only about saving a life. Margaret's body jerked slightly as she coughed, her airways struggling to open. A thin line of sweat traced Dr. Carter's brow, but he didn't stop. He wouldn't stop, because no matter what she had done, she was still a patient. And that meant she was his responsibility. Margaret's chest rose in shallow, uneven breaths as Dr. Carter continued compressions, his hands moving with precise rhythm. The once vibrant woman was now fragile, vulnerable, her life hanging by a thread. Each second stretched into eternity as the officers stood by, watching helplessly. Then, a sputtering cough broke through the silence. Margaret's eyelids fluttered open, her gaze unfocused. A ragged breath escaped her lips as her body slowly responded to Dr. Carter's efforts. Relief flooded his face, but he didn't stop assessing her condition. "Easy," he murmured. "You're going to be okay." The distant wail of an approaching ambulance filled the air. Officer Miller stepped back, his rigid stance unraveling. This was not how he had expected this call to go. He had arrived believing he might be stopping a crime. Instead, he had witnessed something far greater. A man choosing compassion over resentment, healing over vengeance. Margaret's lips quivered as she turned her head toward Dr. Carter. Her eyes held something that hadn't been there before: shame. Gratitude. A silent plea for forgiveness. I misjudged you," she whispered hoarsely. Dr. Carter met her gaze, his expression unreadable. He had seen this before, the moment when ignorance collided with truth, when prejudice cracked beneath the weight of reality. But this wasn't about his pride. It never had been. He simply gave a small nod. "Just focus on breathing," he said gently. The paramedics rushed in, taking over as Dr. Carter stepped back, wiping his forehead. Mr. Henderson, who had watched everything in stunned silence, finally spoke. "Jamal, you're a better man than most," he said with admiration. Sergeant Daniels turned to Dr. Carter, his voice laced with genuine respect. "You saved her life." Dr. Carter exhaled. "That's my job." But deep down, he knew this moment wasn't just about medicine. It was about something far more profound. As Margaret was lifted onto the stretcher, she reached out, her fingers trembling. "Thank you," she managed, her voice cracking. Dr. Carter gave a slight nod, but said nothing. Words weren't necessary. The lesson had already been learned. And as the ambulance doors shut, Margaret Dawson, once blinded by prejudice, left with more than just a second chance at life. She left with an entirely new perspective. The ambulance's flashing lights faded into the distance, but the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. A heavy silence settled over the street, broken only by the soft rustling of the trees. Officer Miller shifted on his feet, his earlier assumptions about Dr. Carter now gnawing at him. He had nearly arrested a man for doing nothing wrong, only to watch him save a life without hesitation. Mr. Henderson sighed, gripping his cane as he turned to Dr. Carter. "People like her, they don't change easily," he muttered. "But I think today, you might have cracked that stone heart of hers." Dr. Carter simply shook his head. "I wasn't trying to teach her a lesson," he said. "I was just doing what any doctor would do." Sergeant Daniels studied him for a moment, then extended a hand. "Well, doctor or not, you have my respect," he said firmly. Dr. Carter hesitated before shaking his hand, sensing the sincerity behind the gesture. Margaret's house stood eerily quiet now, its owner gone, but something about it felt different. Perhaps it was just the knowledge that the woman who had lived there had seen the world through a different lens that day. As Officer Miller prepared to leave, he hesitated. Swallowing his pride, he turned to Dr. Carter. I made a mistake," he admitted. "And I'm sorry for that." Dr. Carter studied him for a moment before nodding. He had encountered men like Miller before, people conditioned to assume the worst about people like him. But acknowledgement was a step forward, and sometimes that was enough. Mr. Henderson clapped Dr. Carter on the back. "Come on, son. Let's get you some tea," he said warmly. The elderly man had seen enough of the world to know that real change wasn't always loud. Sometimes it started in quiet moments like these, in hearts that had been cracked open by truth. As they walked inside, Dr. Carter took one last glance at Margaret's empty porch. A part of him wondered if, when she returned, she would see the world differently. And maybe, just maybe, the next time she saw a man like him, she wouldn't see a threat. She would see a human being. Days passed, but the events of that afternoon lingered in Margaret Dawson's mind like a stubborn shadow. Lying in her hospital bed, she replayed the moment she had gasped for air on the pavement, the moment she had looked up and seen Dr. Carter, the very man she had feared, saving her life. Guilt gnawed at her. The truth was inescapable now. She had judged him unfairly, assumed the worst of him, called the police on an innocent man. And yet, when she needed him the most, he had put everything aside and fought for her life. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned her head, her breath catching as she saw him. Dr. Carter stood in the doorway, his expression calm, unreadable. For a brief second, the old instincts threatened to creep in, the ones that had always told her to put up a wall, to see people like him as different. But that instinct faltered, replaced by something new. "Doctor," she said, her voice quieter than she expected. He stepped forward, checking the monitors beside her bed. "How are you feeling?" he asked professionally. Margaret swallowed. Alive, she admitted, then looked away. Thanks to you. Dr. Carter nodded, but said nothing. There was no pride in his expression, no desire to rub her mistake in her face. Just quiet patience. Margaret took a shaky breath. I was wrong about you, she confessed. About a lot of things. Her fingers twisted in the hospital blanket. I don't expect you to forgive me. I needed to say it. Dr. Carter studied her for a long moment, then finally spoke. Change isn't about words, he said. It's about what you do next. Margaret felt the weight of those words settle deep in her chest. He was right. Saying sorry was easy. Proving it was something else entirely. As Dr. Carter turned to leave, she found herself calling after him. Doctor? He paused, glancing over his shoulder. Margaret swallowed. I'd like to make things right, she said softly. If I can. Dr. Carter gave a small nod. Then start by seeing people for who they are, not who you assume them to be. And with that he left, leaving Margaret alone with the realization that maybe, just maybe, she had been given more than just a second chance at life. She had been given a second chance to be better.